Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see you all, and particularly in the post-lunch session. It's not easy, and it also gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone on the stage here. This is the stage for us, and I want to say something about the Humanities report after a while, but I want to welcome all of you and welcome our speakers. I'm really grateful to Dr. Devika, who has joined us here and today, and we're also grateful to Professor Sadan, who is here with us. I want to introduce them to you one by one. Then, of course, our own Professor Prithvi, Datta, Chandra, Shobhi, who is not unknown to any one of you here, and Professor Gundur, who also has come to join us in this. And I'm actually quite happy that all these World Humanities report, when it started in the early conversation in 2019, just before the COVID struck, we had a meeting, and through that meeting, we had both Professor Prithvi and Professor Gundur were there in that meeting. And Professor Prithvi, as you all know, is a very eminent historian, social historian, a multidisciplinary scholar, I would say, and he works on the dissenting imagination tradition of India, you can say, and on the very complicated but very useful understanding of the religious imagination and the interaction between the religious imaginations, literature, and political ideas. He has also writes, besides his scholarly work, he also writes in the popular media. He has edited the works of A.K. Ramanujan, D.R. Nagaraj, which resulted in the publications of 3 books, Poetry and Prose from Kannada in 2005, The Flaming Feet and Other Essays on Dalit Movement in India, which also was published in 2010. Then Listening to the Loom, Essays on Literature, Politics and Violence is again a very useful book that I personally benefited a lot by reading. It's also published in 2012. Over the years, I think I've also benefited personally the fact that Prithvi is here at Krea with my discussion with him and his interest in history, politics, literature and culture. I'm very happy that he's here as a part of the discussion that we're doing today. I'm also quite grateful to Dr. Devika, who actually is a contributor to the World Humanities report. And many of you know Dr. Devika, and she's a feminist social researcher, teacher, historian, translator, and political commentator. And she's located at the Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram. And there are some who are accomplished bilingual intellectuals. She's one of them. She works fluently in Malayalam and also in English. Not only made a translation that is very good at, but she also works on the materials in Malayalam. And her present interest is in crossing the humanities sciences divide in climate change education in schools. She actually has produced brilliant, outstanding work in taking some of these very complicated, complex ideas to young people in Kerala with the help of simplifying but nevertheless keeping the integrity of ideas and using other tools like paintings, like digital, like different modes of presentation, which can take our ideas to a larger audience. So, Devika, welcome. And I'm very happy to introduce Professor Gundur to you, who is a literary historian specializing in modern Kannada literary cultures and their institutional roots. I know that Professor Prithvi and Professor Gundur have worked on few things together. They have a connection, intellectual collaborations. And Professor Gundur has been teaching at the Tunkuri University, is in the Department of English. But he writes, he's like many of us who are here on this panel, is also a bilingual scholar. He writes in both English and Kannada, both for scholarly journals and the rest in the popular media. His articles have been published in the Economic and Political Weekly, Atlantis, the Journal of Anglo-American Studies, the Indian Express, the Wire, the Hindu, and so on. He translated Foucault into Kannada, that I didn't know, that I'm just reading it now, Professor Gundur. I'm delighted. And he has also been commissioned to translate dear Nagaraj's book on the Shaiva Prative, based on Alama Prabhu's ideas, which was the late dear Nagaraj wrote in Kannada, and now Professor Gundur has been commissioned to translate that in English. Last but not the least, Professor Sadan. Professor Sadan straddles the world of English and the world of Hindi. With a disciplinary background in history, his research has been in the domains of history of visuality and contemporary urban life. He works at the Center for Social Studies, Surat, Gujarat. And within these two broad fields, he has worked on symbols and icons like the Indian national flag, spinning wheel, and Bharat Mata, partisan violence, Hindi literature, history of colors. I had the privilege of listening to Professor Chai about the history of colors, which is actually an extraordinary piece of work. He also worked on neighborhoods, streets, migration, and his publications include Social City, Urban Experience, and the Question of Belonging, which is actually published in 2022. He's also worked on, his other book is, which I like immensely, it's called Reverence, Resistance, and Politics of Seeing the Indian National Flag. It's published in 2016. He also has a book on, again in 2022, the social life of streets in India, histories, contestations, and such activities. The first time that I came to know Professor Cha, he actually was working on Phanishwarnath Renu's writings. And I'm a great fan of Phanishwarnath Renu's writings. In fact, in my class, I have shared some of the Renu's writings with my students while I teach on concepts and political conundrums. A little bit about the World Humanities Report. I wish to actually thank, this is an occasion for me, I plan to do another meeting, and the report is going to be uploaded into a Creative Commons, perhaps by end of this month. I wish to thank all the contributors to the report. As you can see from the notice, we have 13, very lucky number, essays contributed by various contributors, and 12 short videos that together constitute the India report. I've not South Asia, I'm not saying very emphatically because of the COVID and so on, we could manage only few contributions from South Asia, from Pakistan and Sri Lanka. The contribution from Nepal and Bangladesh, they didn't work because of the COVID problems. And it was very difficult to get back to that once things normalized. But, so this is basically, I was counting before this meeting, maybe around 28 scholars who were involved in this work, in terms of writing and in terms of speaking. And I also wish to thank Dr. Sapwan, who actually was a research associate when the work began. He was here he also had a lot of friends here, and Sapwan is now at Ahmedabad University as an assistant professor. And I also want to thank Selja, who also joined me last year to help me in the last bit of work that's happening in the World Humanities Report. And she's here, she's been very helpful to everyone here who were part of this meeting. I also wish to thank Krea University staff, its finance team, our lead, the team led by Sharon. Without their help, actually, it would not be possible for me to undertake this work. Last but not the least, in terms of my acknowledgements, are the funders. The Andrew Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation actually contributed to the making of this part of the report. There are other funders who came in for the larger World Humanities Report. But as far as the South Asia report is concerned, it is certainly supported by these two very important foundations. I also plan by end of the month to do another gathering for the completion of the report, where it is finally all the stuff are uploaded and so on, and then request my colleagues to look at it everywhere and so on and so forth. There are three things I want to say about the report in the context of what we are discussing today. In the conventional reports that you may encounter on humanities, or books on humanities in India or elsewhere, you will not find that they don't, more often than not, do not refer to the humanities written in Indian languages. So, academic humanities, it is true, may be dealing with materials arising out of Indian languages, but they are not focused on the production of humanities knowledge in Indian languages. And so this report, I'm not sure about other parts of the report in Europe or Americas or Australia, whether they've done anything in this respect. We wanted, within our limited mandate, we wanted to actually bring in essay or two dealing with humanities in Indian languages. The humanities knowledge produced, articulated in Indian languages. They may be Bengali, they may be Marathi, they may be Hindi, they may be Kannada, they may be Odia, they may be Bengali. So Devika's contribution to the report is actually an example. We wanted to tell to the people who are interested in the humanities to really pay attention to that word, which within the academia, we do not pay attention to that word except when it is a subject matter on which we reflect or we work with. So this is something which I would say a small but a pointed contribution in terms of conceptual thinking about the humanities in this part of the world. We also quickly realize that there is, it's very difficult to, like in many other things, very difficult to produce a global history of the humanities. history of the academic humanities is not very easy. There is no, for example, if you think of the connection between the way people think about humanities in the ancient Greece, Cicero, Studio Humanitatis, Renaissance universities, and you think of how this, at least in one trajectory of it, or the distinction between how what was being taught as part of the classical scholarship in the 14th and 15th centuries, universities in Europe. There's no one global history that you can really talk about. Although you can find interesting elements, overlapping elements, if you want to really talk about the evolution, the ramifications of all that in the context of multiple locations. You can think about Africa, you can think about Latin America, you can think about South Asia, you can think about Australia. You will find these ideas are actually going through various kinds of changes, including the one in the context of ours, colonialism. And there was a time when humanities, science, was a part of the humanities. That's what at least Cicero meant. Within our own tradition, if you look at, you find that the national education policy, certainly you find a footnote to Datta's Kadambari, which is a 7th century text, which actually talks about humanities connected to, you can say, attributes or kala. Where in Kadambari, Bharata talks about the hero has so many skills, what you can call, your core and skill that we do in Krea. There are many such things that this hero is actually good at. So that you can find that but there was a time when science, the path of science, and part of what you call as humanistic learning today, whether it is language, literature, philosophy, performing arts, and so on, actually had to travel on a very different trajectory. If you look at, for example, purely as a matter of attributes, if you look at how Vishwabharati, for example, was conceptualized and imagined by Tagore, you find what did Tagore imagine Vishwabharati to have? Vishwabharati had study of languages, Indian languages, languages of other countries, Japanese, Chinese, and so on. It had comparative literature. It had performing arts, visual arts. It had agriculture, and so on and so forth. It was a very different combination that Tagore was thinking of when thinking about the university. Why I'm saying this? Because very often the imagination of humanities in academic humanities are done through two registers, either in the register of education or in the register of university. You'll find report after report, people talk about what the education should be like and how the university should be like over a period of time. So the academic humanities which we are part of is something is very important. But this report wants to point towards multiple locations of humanities besides academic humanities. So the point of what I'm saying is that the humanities report for India and South Asia, I think the African report also points toward the same directions, that humanities are not merely done within the universities, humanities are also done and imagined outside academia, outside the universities. So this is again, I would say, a very important contribution as a part of the India and South Asia report. That our report contains ideas not merely generated within academia, but outside academia. And sometimes it will not be out of place if I say that in certain spheres of our knowledge making, civil society actually has overtaken academia. They are a few steps ahead in history. Some ideas are actually there, generated and produced and argued, of course, in different contexts, before academics like us, who then produce and research and do things like that. There's no, I'm not going to say anything more than that. To say that this is something the World Humanities Report for India and South Asia actually take that very seriously. A couple of our contributions are actually generated by a civil society activist and a researcher together. So this is something which we thought we have done, something which is you usually don't find in a conventional understanding of the humanities. And what we're discussing today is, again, I thought, as I said, is a very, very important contribution to that understanding of what humanities, how humanities operate in this part of the world. So when you think about Indian languages, I want to say and stop, is that you can say that humanity is produced in Indian languages. What has actually been written in literary magazines or journals or in Malayalam or in Kannada, in Marathi and so on. This is one. The other thing is that imagination is housed within languages. This, particularly for this report, I think Devika's essay actually is a fantastic example of that. It is not that you are merely producing it in one language, which is also important in the sense, therefore, the work of translations are very important. But it's not merely translations. It's not merely confined only to the translations. It is actually imagining language that we know that is constitutive of our thoughts. This is an idea that we know goes beyond this mimetic and very strict designative functions of language, which the argument that language is a constitutive of thought. And second idea, that language is after all a collective practice. Idea that you find in some of the Indian theoreticians working on language, and also Wittgensteinian idea that, look, after all, it's a social practice. So in both ways, whether it is constitutive of thought or as a social practice, you'll find humanities are done. And if you want to understand the play of humanities in this part of the world, if you want to say that how humanities can really connect, how humanities can connect to other things, the separation that happened in the history between humanities and now the social science and so on, and this is something which is very, very important to understand that why it is happening, why it happened, and so on and so forth. Finally, the panel discussion today is only give us a kind of flavor. As you know, we have limited time and everybody has 20 minutes except Professor Gundur and Professor Prithvi talking about Kannada would have 15 minutes each, half an hour. And our objective is to really to give you a flavor of what that world looks like. There is no exhaustive account of anything here that you'll find. And today when at Krea we talk about interurban learning, when you think about the discussion on the humanities is very important. It's important that not merely to say that there has to be multidisciplinarity, but to really think about the pathways, to think about concrete pathways where disciplines can really become porous. Because what has happened in history, that because there's a lot of pressure, disciplines actually have to create the language of interdisciplinarity to protect their boundaries to some extent. I'm saying something provocative to say that the disciplines require interdisciplinarity as a boundary maintenance exercise. But there are other ways of thinking about how the boundaries work and how the boundaries can be truly bridged and so on. So today, once again, I thank everyone for coming. I thank our panelists. I think the order is like this. I think I want Devika to be the next, and then Professor Gundur and Professor Prithvi, and then Professor Sadan. Give a big hand for Devika.
Thank you, Bishnu. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to all of you who gathered here. And it was indeed a great challenge and pleasure writing this chapter for the World Humanities Report. It required from me a great deal of self-reflexivity. It's a bit like a fish writing about living in water, and about water, because almost the whole of my intellectual life has been spent negotiating precisely the fields across which humanities are spread in Malayalam. So let me just start by telling you what I mean by humanities, before I start about Kerala and Malayalam and so on. Now, I understand humanities as knowledge pertaining to subjective experience in the world. So, towards the meaning of cultural, social, political artifacts or institutions that we human beings actually make and live in. So, in that sense, humanities is what connects my own work across the different fields that I have been part of. In social science, for example, my work has been qualitative, my methodology has been deeply qualitative, interpretive, and that's what brings in an element of humanities into social sciences at that level. Now, in Kerala, so therefore, there would be I would have to make also clear this point that when I talk about humanities, I'm talking about two different kinds of humanities. One is perhaps what I would call the first order humanities, which has to do with art, literary creations, creation in general, poetry, novels, different genres, etc., which is for me first order humanities. And then come the reflections on those which could take the form of literary criticism, research, etc., etc. So there are these two levels of humanities, and how they are spread, and of course these are not watertight compartments, they keep energizing each other, fertilizing each other literally. So, in fact, any study of the humanities, therefore, I would think should examine the interplay, the intercrossings, intertwinings, the fertilization, the mutual fertilization of these two kinds of humanities spread across several fields, which includes the literary public, maybe on the one hand, the academia on the other, and so on. So, any study of humanities, if you want to really give a descriptive account, a full descriptive account, which is not what I've done for the World Humanities Report because it is only a chapter, would have to actually survey these different fields and try to think through their interconnections. Now, so when I'm talking about humanities in Kerala, this is a sense I'm trying to evoke, this kind of a complex field. So, I want to say at the outset that there is a longer history of humanities because we're looking, in this report, we're looking at a fairly recent time period. So, in Kerala, you would say, in the region, Malayalam speaking region, which we now refer to as Kerala, there is evidence that shows that might interest young students to do this, to actually engage in some deeper study of the presence of what I have just referred to as humanities, predating the British era. So if you look at the work of Unai Warrior or Kunjan Nambiar in the 18th century, 17th century, from the 17th century onwards, I am sure, in fact, one would be, if you accept my definition of humanities, there is definitely scope to think about how these emerge, and I would say those are Brahminical humanities actually, if that makes any sense. If you don't place humanism at the heart of humanities and you understand it in the way I propose, then perhaps it may be possible to talk about Brahminical humanities. And then Unai Warrior's Manacharism, or the large corpus of work attributed to by Kunjan Nambiar would fall within that. And then in the 19th century, there is a huge body of work that emerges with the missionary presence in Travancore. That there are counters and counters that are written from local different locations in local society in response to missionary writing. Now this again forms a body of writing which would qualify to be called humanities in the sense that I mentioned. Now, formally, however, if you're talking about like humanities in the sense that he just mentioned, Bishnu mentioned, then you would start formally in the late 19th century with the coming of modern education, with the setting up of the institution of modern education, and which happens alongside the expansion of what is called the ethnographic state, the data collecting, report writing state. So you have social sciences that are already coming in to aid the state on the one hand, but that's only one side of the story. The other side is the coming of aesthetic education curated by the local male Savanna elite, the upper caste elite. So if the ethnographic state with its tools of data collection, analysis, etc. emerging on the one side, along with this is coming aesthetic education encouraged by and shaped by the male elite. And so and that is the project of that kind of work is producing a new nation to which is a correlate of this new ethnographic state. So you have on both sides, if you have social sciences on one side, you have aesthetic education, which is focusing on literature, culture, art, etc. on the other, brought together to form the new nation. The nation of Travancore, you know that part of Kerala, a couple of the southern parts of Kerala were princely states which enjoyed relative independence in such matters. And the idea of a Travancorean nation or Cochin nationality might feel strange today, but was quite relevant to many elites at that point. So literature and what right from the outset, you see that literary criticism and literature were bound closely together, and they form the core of this project of aesthetic education. And with literary criticism having a very major role in shaping and canonizing literature itself at the heart of the nation, of the national culture. But as I mentioned, the objects of this kind of humanities, the humanities at the heart of the nation building project, in which the academia was an important space. This kind of humanities, the objects of these kind of humanities, this is second order humanities, as I told you. The first order humanities, it refers to the literature, poetry, prose, etc., objects of art, etc., which were examined and written about in the projects of the state. Now, this history is quite complex, as I just mentioned. In fact, it continues to remain complex. For example, if you look at the late 19th century writing by women in Kerala, it's interesting how they use a lot of metaphors that are coming from the Marathi anti-caste writing. For example, Sri Purushatul and Tarabai Shinde's work. We know that the first translation of Tarabai Shinde's writing in Malayalam appeared just like 3 or 4, maybe 10 years back in Malayalam. But it is very clear if you read the writings of the women of the late 19th century, the metaphors, the similes that they use are drawn from anti-caste writing, anti-patriarchal writing in Marathi. So how did it reach Kerala? How did it reach this Malayalam speaking region? What were the conduits by which these ideas, these images travel? We don't know. So that's probably something that we work on. But whatever, so what I'm trying to say that this body of the first order humanities that was being worked upon by the second order humanities in the interests of building this new nation, that was a complex process, and there was always this tension. There has always been tension within the humanities in Kerala between the first order and the second order. So you actually see that. So the missionaries, for example. So some we are not very clear about, but some we are pretty clear about. You look at the 19th century missionary writings, you can see that they are bringing in ideas from, say, from the anti-slavery discourse in the US. So Booker T. Washington is translated into Malayalam. Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a Malayalam version of Uncle Tom's Cabin written. So you can see, so in that case you can actually see where the ideas are actually coming from. Then you have the struggles, anti-caste struggles of the early 20th century by the oppressed castes, from the oppressed caste, Sri Narayana Guru, for example. Again, a scholar whose training was primarily in Indian languages, who did not speak English, did not write in English, but transformed these languages in a way that complex modern philosophical articulation became possible in these, transformed the poetic idiom to accommodate philosophical themes, and so on. So then, if you look at the Srinarayana corpus, it is not directed against colonialism or the state, it is directed almost exclusively against society. In fact, the project of generating a society. So, what I'm trying to say is that you have already in humanities at the turn of the century two streams. One is the elite project of building the cultural nation, and the non-elite project of building the casteless social. I mean, the assumption being that there is no such thing as society exists when there is caste, and only in efforts to annihilate caste can you imagine society. So these are the two streams that you already see within humanities. With the academic space is largely devoted to the first project of creating this cultural nation of the elite. So, in fact, if you look at the cultural history of Kerala in the 20th century, you will see an abiding tension between these two. So, you look at for example, the formation of Kerala. You know that Malayalam speaking regions were brought together to form the state of Kerala only at the end of the 1950s, and the preceding 20 years saw a massive campaign to achieve this. And you look at that campaign, if you study the campaign, you would see that there is a very, very strong tension within that campaign between these two streams. Now, with the shifts of the nature of the state in the 20th century from colonial / monarchical to national / democratic, so academic humanities, the tension began to kind of ease a little bit. I mean, it did not end, it did not subside, but it eased. It eased, and you could see that gradually academic humanities began to absorb more and more of the social projects espoused by the second project of the anti-caste. That's why it came through communists, for example. The communists were hugely interested in producing first order humanities in literature, in a whole bunch of different art forms and so on. Now all these products slowly began to enter the academia through syllabi, especially through syllabus revisions and so on. And they were also added to the literary canon gradually. So if you look at early 20th some texts which were rejected by the literary critics as not worthy of being of literary and just subversive nonsense, those texts were accepted as something that needed to be taught in classrooms by the mid 20th century. You can see those shifts. And this process, that is, by which literature and culture continued to be renewed with each tide of democratization progressively absorbed into academic humanities, has continued in the present. A large part of my chapter in the World Humanities report is about this, about how you have a wave of democratization creating a whole set of first order humanities, which gradually gets absorbed into academic humanities. And it continues. So there's a continuous process of renewal and absorption, followed by renewal, like that. Now, however, the role of the classroom in disseminating humanities may have increased over the years in the course of the 20th century, with the rising number of colleges, the number of academic disciplines like film studies, culture studies, humanities, which all count as humanities. But they are not the places where the critical force of humanities is distilled into radical political practice. That, if you want to study that, then you have to maybe get out of academic humanities and look at the literary cultural public in Kerala, which is a very, very important part of the public sphere in Kerala. Was, at least, I mean, I should use the past tense parts. I don't think it is anymore. But if you look at the 1950s, for example, there are people like M. Govindan who called for critical cultural civil society. Now, M. Govindan's call for understanding of civil society is as basis of cultural resistance, which would produce both first order and second order humanities, and to create some kind of critical resistance to majoritarianism, the dominance of the elites, and so on and so on. So you see that throughout the 1950s and 60s, the formation of film societies, book clubs, libraries, reading groups, and so on, throughout the length and breadth of Kerala. And some of the finest films, for example, have been made by people who were involved in these groups, and so on. Then in the 1980s, you had yet another surge, which is by Kerala's New Left, maybe you could call them that. The post-Naxalite group of intellectuals who began to articulate the need for a new canon. So interestingly, they borrowed social theory from the North, the Euro-Marxism, from the North, while culture, literature, etc. all had to be brought in from Africa and Latin America. So you can see that divide there. And there are multiple interpretive lenses also came into use in the 1990s, which also were from new spaces outside the academy, like feminist groups, Dalit groups, tribal articulations, and so on. Now, in the 1990s, gradually, 1980s and 1990s, you saw an upsurge of these groups, these spaces outside the academia. But towards the end of the 1990s, there is, in fact, the coming of humanities in a big way into academia in India. So you have women's studies centers becoming active. You have more than that, you have cultural studies becoming a discipline that comes to be hugely valued. So new universities that were set up in the 1990s with departments of language and literature, they began to absorb cultural studies in a big way. So scholars like Skalia Sakare, for example, played an important role in bringing cultural studies into the curriculum in the late 1990s. Now this, of course, involved a kind of taming, because once cultural studies came to be taught in the classroom, a lot of this writing that was happening outside the academy began to be pulled into the academy and became part of syllabi, revisionings, etc. But then this, as I told you, this absorption really did not change the nature of the academia at all. And partly because, in contrast to the humanistic streams, you don't see humanistic stream, within the humanistic stream, second order humanistic streams, instead of literature, literature used to have this really central role, at least till the middle of the 1990s. Now you see an upsurge in the other kinds of writing. So you have history becoming very important. Within social science, qualitative research methodology becoming very important. And scholars in these disciplines are kind of writing a lot in Malayalam. So you have new books of history in Malayalam, new analysis, a lot of film studies being written in Malayalam, a lot of some cultural studies research actually being written and published in journals in Malayalam, and literary theory or literary analysis, literary criticism kind of taking a backseat, and the market becoming a more salient force in shaping not just the so-called popular reading, but also the so-called high literature as well. And so the center of gravity of the second order humanities shifts from literature and language to culture, cinema, art, history, culture, and qualitative social sciences. So even in Kerala's highly quantitative social science sector, qualitative research becomes a very important presence. This is between the 1990s and now. And a good number of these scholars who contribute to this thrust, they are essentially, they may have roots in Kerala, but they are trained outside Kerala. So the entry of Malayali students into the universities in the national metropolises is an important process. I just want to mention one young scholar, very interesting young scholar, two young scholars maybe. One, Vimal Paul, this young person called Vimal Paul, who studied in one of the local universities in Kerala, but since then went to JNU, did his PhD there, and did a very interesting, innovative, and very groundbreaking kind of work. And he, as a Dalit scholar, and he came back to Kerala, and he is actually, his first language is Malayalam, and he writes better in Malayalam. So his two books are bestsellers. I mean, these are history books, and both have become bestsellers. So you can see that difference. Or Abhilash Malay, who's perhaps Malayalam's most promising young historian, has the same history. Did undergrad studies in Kerala, went out to do his PhD, and now comes back and writes beautifully in Malayalam books that actually sell. So Bishnu's point about paying attention to the humanities and Indian languages, if Kerala is anything to go by, is very, very important. So it indicates that the field of Malayalam humanities is no longer confined to the geographical space of Kerala, but extends to global and national levels. And translation has been an important mode by which this kind of writing by Malayali scholars, Muhammad Krea, for example, who's been writing on the global connections of Kerala's Islamic traditions. His work he writes in Malayalam, and a lot of his work has also been translated into Malayalam. Now, the third significant player in the 1980s, 1990s I want to mention is the market. And the market has now, it almost kind of replaces literary criticism in shaping literary tastes, and in fact, the first order humanities that I mentioned seems to be shaped hugely now by the market. And definitely, there is no doubt that it shapes readers as consumers and not as subjects to be transformed into citizens or whatever. And in fact, whether the market makes an impact, you can also see that second order humanities are affected. A good example I want to point is Vinil's own work. Now, Vinil's book, when it was first published, it's definitely an important critical thrust into the history of Kerala, modern Kerala. But then you can see that the moment it enters it has gained a large readership, and the market suddenly gets interested in him. So the Madhubhumi Weekly runs a series of articles by him, small articles by him, all based on highly, shockingly Eurocentric images of people in Kerala, members of different castes, and each caste with extensive colonial photography, unprompted barbaric they are, etc., etc. So that also comes from Willett, the same person. I mean, he is trying his best to be critical, but the problem is, once you have those images, they are really overwhelming, and unless you actually write critical commentary, just making a few notes on how they were lower caste, etc., that won't help. So you can see wherever the market comes in, the dominant tastes reassert themselves. So literary festival now, big draw is now what the market is doing and how it shapes literary taste is through the literary festivals. So they hold these DC books and Malayalam Madhrubhumi hold these large literary festivals where people are extremely popular. The footfall is like 5 lakh, more than 5 lakh people visiting. These are huge events. And you have humanities being offered in manageable time slots, like 45 minutes, 1 hour, etc., which are consumable and nice. And it's not that they are the only people doing. There are groups of intellectuals who are doing. There's a Calicut Literary Festival organized by young Muslim groups of young Muslim people. Then there is another organized by some friends of ours, teachers at the Brennan College. Dilip Raj, he organizes smaller ones, but these are big, and he actually does it in a conscious way, to counter the market-run literary festivals. But it's very difficult to match this scope. The other, and I want to stop here, is which we have to consider. We haven't really considered is the social media. Now, the social media is seemingly a site where humanities can be, humanities can flourish without the pressure of the state or the pressure of the market. That's what it looks like. But if you look at what is happening in the Malayalam social media, I think what gets formed are not literary publics or cultural publics, but sentimental publics. So somebody writes a book, and then you have everyone say, "Oh, this is my experience. I went through this. Oh my goodness." So it's a sentimental sharing that happens. It's not really, it has nothing to do with really literature. So what the mode is not critical engagement with the text as consumption. So that is clear. And in social media, humanities starts, so you suddenly become a star very quickly. And these are very rarely critical intellectuals. They quickly gravitate towards power and become establishment voices. Of course, that's good because it increases the number of followers, because that particular followers of those particular party will be there, will like everything they write, and increases their market value. And such people manage to get their books published very easily through leading publishers because there is an assured market. So I think that point I haven't put into the report because it's really become visible to us in this form only in the post-pandemic times. So I'll stop there. I think my 20 minutes are up. Thanks.
So I should begin with a confession that both Gundur and I are defaulters in that we didn't manage to finish our essay. And I can blame Bishnu for that, because in the year just before the pandemic, he gave me enough work to keep me completely busy. But then, Gundur and I also became too ambitious and came up with a framework that meant we were writing a 30,000 word essay, which was completely impossible. We did actually work out a very nice scheme, and what I want to do is to briefly talk about some of the big ideas, at least two big insights that we wanted to work on, and show the sites, the diverse sites, as Bishnu said, of humanistic knowledge production. In a sense, as Devika pointed out, you can provide a similar counterpart, not just to Kannada, but many other Indian languages about humanistic knowledge production during colonial times, the social reform movements that emerged, anti-caste movements that emerged, particularly in South India. So you have similar trends in Karnataka. But for us, the starting point was a little bit more of a focused one, which is to actually take the making of modern Karnataka quite seriously. And in a sense, our essay began with the defeat of Tipu in 1799, because that marks for us the radical, the end of any kind of Kannada political subjectivity. And our case is that, our submission is that, and this is in a sense the theoretical intervention of the point that we were going to make, it is in the making of a Karnataka political subjectivity or a Kannada political subjectivity that humanistic knowledge gets produced. So that happens through an engagement with the past. But you could talk about other kinds of humanistic knowledge traditions in Kannada, going back to medieval period, and Bishnu hinted at, pointed out how the new education policy actually talks about a more holistic. They have no idea what is the holistic sense in which actually different knowledge domains came together in pre-modern Indian intellectual traditions. For example, if you look at how Gaja Shastra, Rashva Shastra prominently figured in classical texts and their connections with other traditions which were cognate disciplines to them, whether it's theology or aesthetics, Malayalam Shastra, and so on. So we have very little understanding of how these disciplines work together, or what is a holistic perspective on the kind of humanistic knowledge that was produced in pre-18th century world. But that's a separate discussion for another day. So what we started with was actually the unification of Karnataka in 1956. And as you can see, I won't go into the details in the interest of time. It was, one of the cases that we would make is there are other languages like Odia or Gujarati, Rajasthani, or Malayalam even, where territories were under multiple either principalities or presidencies. In the case of Kannada-speaking regions, the Mysore Princely Kingdom, Hyderabad, Bombay Presidency, and Madras Presidency were the four major territorial units. But there was also Coorg, there were also other smaller principalities which came together to form this. But the argument that we would make here is that this unification, which is a political project, was actually preceded by and facilitated by intellectual efforts which produced this subjectivity. And that was that occurred through an engagement with pre-18th century history, pre-Tipu history, whether it's Vijayanagara, Hoysalas, Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, and Kadambas, and so on and so forth, and connected that with literary production, knowledge production, whether it's in the literary realm or in the realm of Shastras or in the realm of epic traditions, folk epics, and so on and so forth. So it's the coming together of all of this which actually is quite critical in the context of Kannada. So the intellectual and cultural roots of this political project are what we actually wanted to focus on in our essay. And here there's one aspect that I should bring in, which was not going to be part of this essay, but something which I've been working on for some time now, which is how does social change occur in modern Karnataka? And this, I've argued elsewhere, that it occurs through the production of a progressive consensus. And this again is associated with the project of making of Karnataka. So how does Karnataka become modern? It becomes modern through a bunch of measures around which a consensus is built. And this consensus is basically on these four pillars. There's an anti-caste dimension, there's land reforms, there is decentralization of power, all of which are political steps. I mean, there are intellectuals who have been arguing for this in the first half of the 20th century, but more forcefully through socialist influence, through Gandhian influence in the 50s and 60s. But this becomes the political agenda for the state of Karnataka in the 70s and 80s, and this is what gets implemented. And I wanted to bring this in the context of, make this point in the context of our discussion here, humanistic knowledge of production of humanistic knowledge in Karnataka, precisely because of the role ascribed to Kannada here. Right? Kannada is forcefully made the language of administration, and there's this demand built around it, and so it becomes the language of education in higher education, especially. So by 1960s, the universities of Karnataka, higher education courses are being, whether it's undergraduate level or postgraduate level, they're being offered in Kannada, and that facilitates humanistic production of humanistic knowledge, particularly at the side of university, but also, as we will see in just a second, in a variety of other institutional contexts. So the larger point then is, right, the political project is, it coalesces with the intellectual and cultural project, and that is at the heart of the kind of social change that is brought about both through civil society interventions, but more importantly through state interventions. Just to take 30 seconds to explain that. In the 1970s, reservations, Kannada-speaking regions already had a history of about 50, 60 years of actively implementing reservations, but under Devraj Araj, right, there's a radical proposal to extend reservations for other backward castes and deny reservations to forward castes, especially landed castes. Similarly, there is a consensus built around intercaste marriages, so anti-caste discourse gets greater state support as well, because there is recognition to provide some sort of encouragement, whether it's in financial terms or in terms of preserving educational opportunities or employment opportunities to those who actually get married outside of the caste. Right? And then land reforms is again unheralded success. It has its limitations, but it's an important part of this process in Karnataka, again in the 70s. Decentralization of power, institutionalization of Panchayat Raj institutions in the 1980s when Ramakrishna Hegde is the chief minister. And finally, throughout the 80s and 70s and 80s, the prominence provided to Kannada as the language of education and education and administration. So going back to the point that Bishnu was making, I'm going to just take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about the rest of my slides. One of our efforts was to actually catalog the different kinds of sites which emerged. And here there are some really interesting particulars that we wanted to draw your attention to. And something you may not see in other states in India. So in Karnataka, Mysore University is one of the oldest universities, started in 1916, 7th university in India. And here, this is where Kannada became the language of instruction in higher education by the end of 1950s. There is Kannada University, which was established in Hampi, again following on the model of Tamil University. But these are important universities because they have publication divisions which were publishing hundreds of books. Kannada University Hampi, for instance, publishes at least 100 books a year. They're bringing out encyclopedias, they're bringing out histories of all kinds, local, micro, history, multiple volumes, 7-volume history of Karnataka, 10-volume history of the world. These kinds of really ambitious efforts which bring in hundreds of scholars together. And then now you have more than 50 public universities, some of them, focusing on languages. There's a Sanskrit university, there's a folklore university, there's a Panchayat Raj university, right? So there are demands to establish a sports university. So this establishment of universities has become a favorite pastime for politicians for a variety of reasons. But what is also interesting is the is the connection to knowledge production and the belief in the institutional form itself. Moving on, the state institutions. Kannada, Ministry of Kannada and Culture has more than 1,000 crores budget. It's not insignificant, and it has a whole bunch of academies, many of which organize activities throughout the year, publish dozens of books. Not just literary academy, but Kannada is again Karnataka is one of those states where you have an academy for every minority language, and resources are provided for these academies to conduct their activities. There's also a Kuempu Bhasha Bharati Pradhikara, which is for translation. There's a Kannada Pustaka Pradhikara, which publishes books but also facilitates publication of books or selling of books, brings together publishers. So the institutionalization, right, of these kinds of entities is something which is actually quite interesting. They're all very active in book publication, and you can see them in the kind of large literary festivals that Devika was talking about across the state, selling their books. There's also theatre repertory called Rangayana with multiple centers. There are professional theatre repertories, both for folk art traditions and for professional theatre itself. Civil society institutions. Kannada Sahitya Parishat is perhaps the most well-known. It organizes Kannada literary festivals every year. Again, the annual event actually becomes an opportunity for writers and politicians to come together and lament on the state of politics and on the state of culture, literature. But at the same time, there's also a celebration of what has been achieved. And Kannada Sahitya Parishat again is an entity which publishes at least 100 books every year. You have other institutions. I won't go into the details. Monasteries, mathas are extraordinarily influential in Karnataka. Run educational institutions. Some of these educational institutions are worth at least a couple of $1 billion, 10,000-15,000 crore assets. They have research centers, universities, multiple universities owned by each. There are 4 or 5 major mathas which own, which manage multiple universities. So they publish all kinds of stuff. Very important, very interesting. I'll end with, just alerting you to the site of social movements, farmers movement, Dalit movement, feminist movement, which have been extraordinarily active. People who have been, activists of these movements have also been in universities. They've been in other institutional sites. For instance, there would have been office bearers in the academies or in other or would have worked with mathas. So there is also always a circulation of people amongst these institutions, which is something quite fascinating. So the Kannada language movement itself has been quite influential as well in reinforcing the centrality of Kannada to the making of Karnataka and to keep that agenda to move forward. The last 2 points I think are quite interesting, and that's where I'm going to stop. So there is an effort which is quite fascinating to use some of the conventional art forms to think about or figure out if there are new modes of inquiry. Right? For example, there's this form called Talamaddale, which is a dialogic question and answer kind of form, which now is being used to ask modern questions, right? The questions that we might ask in philosophy, and to see whether that form can actually be repurposed to ask questions about equality, questions about politics. And that's one interesting thing. And my last point is about something where Devika also ended, social media. But I want to point at YouTube channels, which now have become probably some of the most interesting spaces where contemporary histories are being generated. So if you want to, listed some themes here: cinema, crime, policing, history of the underworld. You have police officers who are, I can think of at least half a dozen police officers who have spoken for more than 100 hours on YouTube, basically documenting the history of crime in Bangalore or in Karnataka over the last 30 years. Veerappan, you will probably find 250 hours of footage. You don't need to go to an archive, you don't need to go to a newspaper office anymore in order to write an essay on Veerappan now. All you need to do is to sit in front of a computer and that becomes your archive. And believe me, you can actually do a good book on Veerappan just by relying on what is available on YouTube. So these are now becoming new spaces to produce histories, but also create new digital archives. And that is, again, a fascinating new phenomena that we need to be alive to. So if you're looking at the range of resources which different sets of institutions that we have tried to outline here have produced, the sites are diverse, and the kind of output is actually quite, the quantity of it is quite impressive. In the second part, Gundur is going to take on a couple of these sites and speak at some length about publishing in particular. But let me stop there and again remind you of the central premise that we started with, which is the political subjectivity and its connection to these different diverse sites of cultural production.
Yes, I will take my cues from Dr. Bishnu Mohapatra's note, a very precise and insightful note. I'll take a cue from that, and also naturally a cue from Dr. Prithvi. In both your notes, there are two aspects. In your this thing, you are focusing on two outsides. One is outside the English language and outside the academia. You would like to focus on these two aspects. But actually, although we are defaulters, but Prithvi has written a very interesting framing sort of abstract to the report. It is really, I have filled only data to it, though it is incomplete, but this framing is so important that it changed my research program in the English department, and I'm fighting with my colleagues, this disciplinary boundaries that is the power of his framing. I'm very grateful to him. So Prithvi talks about two formations. One is the state formation and the formation of intellectual culture in Karnataka. So the state formation is interlinked with the intellectual formation, knowledge production. This is an important insight. So Kannada's engagement with humanities has been part of a larger, I quote Prithvi, intellectual and cultural project to produce a linguistic state. And this has got two functions. One is to produce the knowledge of self in Kannada and knowledge of the world in Kannada. So one of the aims of our essay was to describe the diverse institutional sites as Prithvi did. So I will take one example to illustrate these points. That example is Manohara Granthamala. It is still there in Dharwad, the still old building. It still exists. This is where writers like Chandrasekhar Kambar and Karnad were literally produced. Without that, we wouldn't have these writers. The birth of this Manohara Granthamala, he is the founder, G.B. Joshi, and the origin of this publishing house goes back to Gedera Gumpu, Bendre, the 20th century lyrical poet, one of the makers of Navodaya movement in Kannada, in the company of Shivarama Karanta and Kuvempu, Masti. So he had two choices. One, to choose Dharwad, to choose Dharwad and Pune, Kannada and Marathi. His first poem was written in Marathi, but he chose for various historical reasons to come and settle in Dharwad, and he committed himself to the cause of Kannada. So he began this Gedeyar Gumpu, and he invited all these friends, and G.B. Joshi was one of them. But this Gumpu, this literary coterie, was a very, very short-lived. It began in 1918 and ended in 1930s. Bendre wrote one poem called Narabali, which was misread as a kind of criticism against the British Raj, and he was sent to jail. And this is how Gedeyar Gumpu comes to an end. And Gedeyar Gumpu was also important because its relationship with the print culture, and the literary activities, with which G.B. Joshi was part of it, and he was editing a journal, Jaya Karnataka. And with the dispersal of this Gedeyar Gumpu, and he lost his job. So the only job, he in the meanwhile he got a job in Indian Railways, but he had this gilu, this obsession for literature. Therefore Girish Karnad calls him an impractical genius. He did all kinds of experiments with publishing, and he burnt his hands, so on and so forth. And three of them come together, and they form Gedeyar Gumpu 1933. When that Gedeyar Gumpu was closed, then he was asked to take over this publishing house, and the mandate was to publish more of narratives, fiction and short stories. This is an interesting history. I will not focus here on that. So the publication house began with Betigeri Krishna Sharma's Sudarshana. That was the first novel they published, 1933. And Joshi was committed to the production of book in Kannada. So, and what he would do is, he would go to the authors and he would beg for manuscripts. And almost all Navodaya writers, they are the product of at least one or two books of those writers like Shivram Karanta, including some of the essays of Kuvempu and Lankesh, because there was a lot of talk in Dharwad about this Brahmin and non-Brahmin. That's a different thing. And Anantapurti Samskara, and of course I will come to Girish Karnad later. They are the producers of some of the classics, especially novels like Rao Bahadur's Ramayana and Shankar Mukashi Punekar's Gangava Gangamai. So they produced, and not only that, G.B. Joshi would take all the books on his shoulder and move in the northern part of Karnataka to school teachers, and he would give them books. Sometimes he would get money, sometimes he couldn't. So this is how he started subscription for publication house. And the most important thing, this publishing house, which is still alive, is important for producing two literary figures apart from others. It also produced readers, actually. That is very important. It produced readers of Kannada literature. Two prominent figures are, one, Kirtinath Kurtukoti. He is a very prominent critic, was a professor of English and deeply rooted in Kannada literary culture and Sanskrit studies. You see, he worked as, before the Kirtinath Kurtukoti, Dara Bendre and Ramsi Mugudi, literary historian, they were the consulting editors for the publishing house, and Kirtinath Kurtukoti succeeds them, and he was such an erudite scholar. He would rewrite the entire manuscript of many authors, including Girish Karnad. And many times Girish Karnad has acknowledged this, how Kirti, he used to call him Kirti corrected his Kannada language. So what happens, Kirti never wanted, like in English department we become default critics, but he was not of that sort. He accidentally became critique because Manohara Granthamala published after 25 years of its inception, Nadedu Bandu Dari, the path traversed, taking their previous publications and produced a volume volume. And Kurtukoti was asked to write a preparatory essays on each form, poetry, novel, drama, literary criticism, etc. And later it became a Kannada critical classic, Yugadharma ಮತ್ತು ಸಾಹಿತ್ಯ ದರ್ಶನ, literary vision and the spirit of an epoch. This is the birth of a literary critic. Therefore, Kirtinath Kurtukoti says, I never thought I would become a critic. I was to wear the mask of a critic on this occasion. I could not remove this mask. So, this is an extraordinary thing, and by then Kurtukoti became an established critic with Yugadharma. And the second thing is Girish Karnad, and it is still like this. Karnad, we can't imagine Girish Karnad without Manohar Granthamala, and he acknowledges it in his autobiography. Actually, it is Manohara Granthamala which discovered the dramatic genius of Girish Karnad. Karnad wanted to be a poet, like on par with W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, and he was on his fellowship in England, and he read some part of Mahabharata, and all of a sudden those characters started speaking to him, and he produced ART, and he sends the script to G.B. Joshi. G.B. Joshi did not care for it, and he keeps on it. Then somehow it reaches the hands of Kirtinath Kurtukoti, and he finds the dramatist in Girish Karnad. So this is how the birth of dramatist with ART takes place, and this is very important. In Kannada it is called MGM Atta, Manohar Granthamala Atta, the staircase. This is where all these people used to gather, including Kambar, A.K. Ramanujan and Kurtukoti. So it was not merely a place for producing books, but also producing literary chit-chats. Kurtukoti would read his essays. Even Karnad would read some of his dialogues on the staircase on this Atta. And this is where A.K. Ramanujan and Kurtukoti became Karnad's literary mentors. And Karnad rose his tughlaq to Kurtukoti, because Kurtukoti made a comment that there are no historical plays in Kannada, there are only costume plays. So he went on discovering the episodes of Indian history, then he found an important subject. So this is, and then this is also Chandrasekhar Kambar's first. He wrote a different kind of Helthani Krea, a folk narrative. He was afraid of, giving the manuscript to the publisher. But later Kurtukoti appreciated it, and then this is how Kambar becomes a great writer. So finally what Manohara Granthamala did was, it turned literary chit-chat into literary ethos. Even I have learned many new insights. When I was studying in Dharwad, not in the English department corridors of knowledge, Karnataka University. Here I learned many new things about Kannada literature and literary culture. So far, this publishing house has brought out more than 500 titles in book form, novels, short stories, plays, etc., etc. Then Putta Bandara in 5 volumes to commemorate Golden Jubilee, and also it brought out some for some years Manvantara journal. This is very important. Then it also engaged with other, apart from publishing house, publishing books. The MGM's literary public sphere included literary festivals, music concerts, and theatre festivals. Something like, even Bhimsen Joshi, his cousin, participated in these concerts and these festivals, and a Sahityotsava in Gadag. The Joshis are basically from Gadag. It's a small town in North Karnataka. And Sahita Sahitya Samparka in Dharwad. And 7 editions of Sahitya Sambrama, literature festival in Dharwad, based on other modern corporate literary festivals. So this is the short account of publishing house Manohara Granthamala. Thank you, and NJM remains a living tradition of humanistic practices in Kannada language.
Okay, and at the outset, I must place my thanks and gratitude to Bishnu, to Chandra, who coordinated with me, and to Krea. When Bishnu called me and sent me the notes, that's the first time when I started thinking about humanities in Hindi. So in that sense, I must apologize that I am quite latecomer. I am recent compared to other panelists here. So it's just been, I've started thinking on this issue, and it's been hardly 1 month or 2 months time. So this apology is also because you may experience incoherence in my presentation. Also because unlike perhaps, I'm basically trained in discipline of history, so I'll be more focusing on history, and my other research interest is in city, urban life. So unlike Marathi or Bengali or Malayalam or Kannada, in when we talk about Hindi, we don't have good historiographical interventions or documentations or analysis of history writings in Hindi. There is just one article, good survey article, that came in 1961, C.H. Phillips' classic work, Historians of India, Pakistan and Ceylon. So that's by H.L. Singh. So there is a kind of dearth in this, and there is no systematic documentation of history writing, at least I am not aware of. So in a sense, what I thought to talk about was to little bit give you a kind of overview, because it's not possible to go in detail in 20 minutes time of this entire 200 years, because Hindi started, and particularly knowledge production in Hindi, the Hindi as we know started with Fort William College. So I put few pictures just to illustrate things. But as we were talking, I'll focus more on the last 60-70 years, more contemporary period. But this is just to give you a kind of reference point. It's a large canvas, as I said, and there are so many domains within Hindi. It's not possible to cover the translated work as against also the original work. There has been debate on all these things, whether we should value translation, or whether when we talk about knowledge production in Hindi, original work should be more prioritized. So there are all these debates also around academic, non-academic. So these are binaries, and we cannot escape, we cannot ignore. We have to engage with these things. Now if we move further, this is Fort William College I was talking. Lallu Lal was the teacher there, and he translated Tulsidas Vinay Patrika. But from 1800 to 1846, we don't have any original work coming out from this. Yeah, this is considered as the first, original work, yet it was also a translation. And this is Bharatvarshi Itihas by Pandit Bansidhar. This is from the second edition. This is from 1856. It first came in 1846. Then Itihas Chandrika came in 1847. I'm just going very quickly. This is the late 19th century scenario. In between, we have very famous intervention by Raja Sri Prasad Singh Sitare Hind, who wrote 3 volumes, Itihas Timir Nasak. He was also, the whole idea was to write textbooks for, students in vernacular language, in Hindi. So there was a kind of a zeal to educate people, and this is very crucial because this is Hindi Pradeep, a magazine from late 1870s. This is the cover page of the first issue, produced by published and edited by a person called Balkrishna Bhatt. And Raja Sri Prasad Singh Sitare Hind, Balkrishna Bhatt, they all were part of the group headed by Bhartendu Harishchand, very important literary figure. Now here, if you look at the imagination, the call, it says Vidya Natak Samacharavali, Itihas, Parihas, Sahitya, Darshan, Raj Samandhi. So it covers a large canvas. And I was going through these volumes, issues of this magazine, and you had discussion of Plato's, politics, or new discoveries in science. So the imagination was to educate people with whatever new things, both in the sphere of idea as well as in the material life, in technology, science, were taking place in the West. That imagination, that canvas, I think when we compare to the contemporary, is very fast shrinking. We don't get that, kaleidoscope, that range. Even if you look at a very famous magazine called Saraswati, which was edited by Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi, another very tall figure. And in the first few, issues, you come across long essays on photography. So that imagination, I particularly wanted to signpost here. Now, in that discourse, starting from mid-19th century, I hinted at, to say 1910, was also very self-conscious about lack. What are the things that Indian scholarship was lacking? And here, in this cartoon, you see the first chair, which is Itihas. It is empty. So they were very conscious about what they are lacking and what they want to improve upon. This is not to miss that there was no production of historical knowledge taking place simultaneously. So for example, this is a small booklet cover page. It's on Tatia Bhil. This is roughly the same time period. This is from 1903. Now the reason I was mentioning all this was that when you look into the historiographical discourse, for example, H.L. Singh's, you don't come across this range. It is more focused on major interventions rather than what's happening, what Bishnu you said, outside the domain of academy. So this is why we need to pay attention to these, Another aspect I wanted to signpost was huge investment in making glossaries, dictionaries, and in collecting folk knowledge and folk wisdom, something that you also pointed out. So, for example, here, this is from 1931, and this is about Khag and Bhaddari, two folk figures, and there are a lot of sayings that go by this thing. Now, by this time, another important thing is to remember is that we have now various academies coming up, and particularly two academies whose contribution we must acknowledge. One is this Hindustani Academy from Allahabad, and then there are lot of state departments, you can say, for example, Bihar Rashtra Bhasha Parishad and all those things. So this is again the previous one was about folk saying, and this is about the dictionary.